Then there's California, our podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. 2020 will be a profound and radical year for our country and for California. If for no other reason, 2020 is the year of the census, this decennial national headcount that plays a huge role in the continuing maturity of American democracy. And, as is the case with pretty much every social and economic and policy-driven notion that is at the top of our country's collective agenda, the stakes are sky high for California, with political representation and needed federal dollars in the balance. California is committed to a complete and accurate census count, but considering the sobering statistics showing the 2020 census could lead to the worst undercount of communities of color in the U.S. since 1990, it's going to take more than just a friendly call to line up and be counted. It's going to take feet on the ground, strategic heart and soul to convince many who live in California, who already have a deep and abiding distrust in the government, and who can blame them, that the census does affect and can protect the future of their neighborhoods, their families, and their lives. On this edition of Then There's California, we're talking about the 2020 census with two California state senators who, with their legislative leadership on the census, as well as the clarity of understanding that they bring to the people and priorities in their own respective districts, will help make it that much more likely that all California communities are counted in the 2020 census. State Senator Tom Umberg represents Garden Grove in Orange County, the 34th Senate District. Senator Umberg is the chair of the Senate Elections Committee, and particularly appropriate for this discussion, he is also the co-chair of the Senate Select Committee on the 2020 census. And Senator Jim Beall represents the 15th Senate District in Northern California, Santa Clara County in particular. He is chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, and like his colleague here, Senator Tom Umberg, he brings a career's and a lifetime's worth of experience and perspective in transportation issues, housing, government efficiency, and boy, is that experience and perspective ever more needed than now in our state's effort to conduct the 2020 census. Both senators have joined me on this podcast before, and it is a pleasure to have them join me again. Senator Umberg, Senator Beall, welcome back to Then There's California.
Yeah, hi.
Well, thanks. Appreciate your interest in this very, very important subject matter.
Absolutely, especially as time goes on here this year, it's becoming more and more of an importance. So, gentlemen, we're getting ready to once again exercise one of the cornerstones of our democracy this year. The census is already underway in Alaska, and California and many states will go online and full throttle with their count in April. And as I mentioned in the opening, as is the case with every other undertaking we start or take part of in this state, the stakes are profoundly high for California. So, Senator Umberg, starting with you, from your vantage point as co-chair of the Select Committee on the Census, how profoundly high are the stakes?
Well, I think they're higher this time around than they've been in my lifetime. California has a lot at stake in this census. Every person must be counted, and for every person who is not counted, we in California lose over $1,000 per person per year for our roads, for our schools, for health care. And so it's vitally important that every single person be counted. And also there's an issue in terms of representation in Washington. We want to have very robust representation in Washington. We want to make sure California gets its fair share of the billions of dollars that we send back to Washington, D.C.
Senator Beall, what do you say?
The stakes are billions of dollars. Specifically, as chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, we get $6 billion a year from the federal government in gas tax receipts. They're money that we pay into the federal gas tax, and it's distributed to the states based on population formula. So if we don't have a good census count, we could actually lose billions of dollars.
As I said, California is committed to doing this census right, and the U.S. Census Bureau seems consistently optimistic about the viability of this year's count. Are you feeling that sense of commitment and optimism as we move forward? Your perspective on that?
Well, I certainly feel a sense of commitment on the part of the state of California. We've put a vast amount of resources in this effort, $187 million by the state. Other areas are putting in money themselves and human beings and time and sweat and treasure to make sure that we do get a complete count. I'm not naturally optimistic, and so I want to be optimistic about this, but I'm going to be doing whatever I can to make sure that every single human being in California gets counted.
Well, it's a presidential election year and the political turmoil, and maybe some people are kind of afraid of actually coming and filling out their census forms. That would be a big mistake because billions of dollars are at stake. And California needs to have a complete count. We need to have a count that is equal or better than all the other states in the country. It's, in a sense, a competitive census. If we do better than other states, we get more money, we get better representation in Congress, and it's a fair amount of money coming to our state that our citizens need.
There's a lot I want to talk about here, and you have both touched upon it a bit already, some based on the headlines from the last year and some of the stories of fear in the news, the feared undercount of some of the communities in the state, the fallout and impact of the now non-existent citizenship question and how it still threatens to haunt the census. And I also want to talk about the challenge and the opportunity to break through the distrust in government and the system to encourage communities to participate in the census for their families and their communities. When it comes to prep and rollout of the 2020 census count in California, Senator Beall, let's start with you. What is happening in your 15th Senate district in Northern California?
Well, our district is mainly the city of San Jose, and we have one of the most worldwide diversity of any area of California. We have people from all over the world. In fact, 40% of our population comes from immigrant families. We have a need in our county to have a complete count in the census, and we have to go out and have those language skills, these other kinds of efforts that we can communicate with people in an appropriate manner to do our complete count for our census. So we're working very, very hard on our outreach. The state and the county and the city governments are all working together, multiple languages, reaching out to every nook and cranny of the district to attempt to find everybody and count everybody and alleviate the fears that they might have about the federal government and all this rigmarole that you have in terms of the political scene that's going on in the country right now. That kind of hurts our efforts, but we're going to try to overcome that.
And Senator Umberg, what's happening in Orange County in the 34th District?
So my staff and I are working hard with our local communities. We're blessed with a really diverse community of between Santa Ana, Garden Grove, Westminster, Long Beach, Huntington Beach, Seal Beach, Fountain Valley, Los Alamitos. We're really blessed with a great diversity in terms of socioeconomic level, but also in terms of language. And so it can be a little bit intimidating for some who aren't familiar with the census and aren't familiar with the process to make sure they're counted. And so it's our job to ensure that those communities that might be undercounted are not, and that they understand, this is really important, let me underline this, that when you fill out the census form, that is confidential. I am confident that that won't be used for any other purpose than for counting Californians. And unfortunately, there's been some muddling of that message, but it's a top priority to make sure that not only people counted, but that information be kept confidential, and I am confident will be.
As we move on, let's get to some meat and potatoes, Democracy 101 census facts that in a perfect world, and of course no census is perfect, will be key to Census 2020 in California, making it work, why it's important, and what will be at stake after the fact as the numbers come in. So first, Senator Umberg, you tell us, as co-chair of the Senate Select Committee on the Census, how will the census roll out in California? What's the timeline?
So right now, folks are being hired to be the enumerators, the people that can knock on doors or will be knocking on doors. That's happening right now. Very soon, people are going to get information online about filling out the census form. They can fill it out as soon as they receive it. Then you'll get a postcard at your residence. You'll get a postcard encouraging you to fill out the census form. And if you don't do those things, then an enumerator, a person, a human being will come to your door or will personally contact you after the 1st of April to have you fill out the census form. I am hopeful that folks will go ahead and fill out the census form either on paper or online without the necessity of somebody knocking on their door. But let me underline again, it's critically important that everybody do it, and everybody do it for every member of their family. Doesn't matter how young or how old they are.
And Senator Beall, I want your comment on the fact that this census effort is critical to fair political representation in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento, correct?
One person, one vote is our U.S. Constitution and our state constitution. So we're going to try to get as close as we can to one person, one vote in terms of all the legislative districts, 40 members of the state Senate, 80 members of the state legislature and the assembly. So we have to have a complete count to have a fair representation in California. And that's kind of the first step that we need to have after the census is done. And in the 2022 election, those new districts that were going to be drawn by the Election Commission, which is a nonpartisan commission, will draw the boundaries and have the election for the members in the 2022 election. There's also, if you get right down to it, Congress. There's fair representation. They'll have the members of Congress distributed. If we don't have a proper count, we could even lose a seat in Congress. California would have a takeaway, and we lose a seat of Congress if we don't get a fair count. Then you go down to the county supervisor and the city council, school board members. A lot of those seats are represented by districts. They all get divided up in terms of one person, one vote. So the districts are done at the local level as well as the state and federal level.
And it actually is, in fact, mandatory. I mean, easier said than done trying to force people to participate, but it is mandatory, right?
There are few things that are required of someone who lives here in California. If need be, you are called to jury duty. You have to pay your taxes. You should vote, and you must participate in the census.
Well, we try to make it as close to mandatory as possible, but we don't force people to fill out the forms. But we'd like to have everybody make the effort to fill out the forms and accommodate our census count.
You had touched on this before, but let's reaffirm census data safe and confidential, in fact?
So I want to make sure that we also underline this point, is that by law, census data is kept confidential. And not only am I confident that the law is enforced, I'm also confident that the organizations, both in state and federal government, are very conscientious about making sure that that information is not disseminated to anyone who doesn't, who's not part of the census itself.
Yes, it is confidential, and quite frankly, there's never been a known case where somebody was penalized or hurt because of filling out a census form. That's not happened in the history of our country. So I think people have to realize that this is an important obligation they have if they want to live here, and let's get this job done so we can have the complete count in California.
Okay, let's say that I am a constituent of the Senate district. Let's say I am on the fence about whether I want to take the time and effort to participate in this census, to go online and share the details of my family and my home. Why should I care about the census? Which, in some people's minds, may be a different question than why it is important. Perhaps.
Well, the reason you should care is because the way resources are allocated, our tax dollars are allocated, is heavily dependent upon the numbers of folks in our community. And so if you care about your roads, if you care about transportation, if you care about education, whether it's for your own children or for the future doctors who may take care of us in our old age, if you care about those things, then you must fill out the census. You need to fill out the census. It impacts everybody, because if you don't, for every person that's not counted, that means that it's a loss to you and to me of over $1,000 for those things, for the roads, for schools, for health care.
If you care about having a representation in the state of California that's equal or better than other states, then you should care. I think our state needs to have a complete count. It will help us do all those things.
What is different about this census versus past censuses? There's more people living in California than there were 10 or 20 years ago, but elaborate on that. What's different about 2020? What's at stake that you can reflect on here?
Well, I mentioned the impact on our own California's financial situation in terms of schools and health care and transportation. We want to make sure, too, that we have sufficient representation and fair representation in Washington, D.C. And if we don't count all the Californians, we may lose a congressional seat, which means we just have a little less of a powerful voice in Washington.
What is the census asking? And more importantly, maybe we should say, what is the census not asking?
Well, the census will ask you, like, who you are and your age, all those kinds of demographic information, so that we can then use the information to understand our communities better, understand the income of people, whether or not they have housing needs, all those questions. Information can be obtained from the census, and it would help the government perform better. If we have no information and no data, we can't perform as well as we should. So the information will be used in a appropriate way to make government work better, if you want to say it that way. Also, it will be available to the public in terms of the aggregate data, in terms of finding out what your neighborhood's like, who lives in your neighborhood, what kind of population you have, age, ethnic origin, race, all those kinds of issues will be laid out in the census.
Let's talk about the citizenship question. The Supreme Court last year blocked the Trump administration from manipulating the census with the citizenship question. But its mere existence and evocation was designed to have a chilling effect on vulnerable portions of our population. In my opinion, the census has been weaponized, and this is the thing that gets me the most. That's what the sinister goal was. So I want to get from you what fallout still lingers on this issue. On-the-ground volunteers, community members, is everybody doing their best to help reduce the shock and fear?
So I think there is a lingering concern with respect to how that information is going to be used. As you mentioned, there is no question on the census form concerning your citizenship status. That's why I emphasize that it is confidential, that when you fill it out, it will have no impact on you, your relatives, and their citizenship status or their status here in California. Sadly, because this specter has been raised, it's our responsibility as leaders here in California to make sure that folks understand and are confident that that information is only going to be used for its intended purpose, to just assess how many people are here and a few questions about their needs.
Senator Beall.
We have a census outreach program in our area that is a massive outreach program. We have funded it through state and local funds at a very large level. So we are trying to reach out to people to say, don't be afraid. In fact, if you want to challenge those kinds of assertions regarding immigrants and the attacks on immigrants, send us information in the census, because that's the best way you can challenge it. If they're successful in scaring immigrants and making them so they won't fill out the forms, we'll lose seats in Congress. And if we lose seats in Congress, who knows where those seats will go? They might go to states that aren't as friendly to immigrants as California has been. California is a worldwide kind of approach to government. We respect all immigrants. We care about the different types and diverse people that we have in the state of California. My particular area, Silicon Valley, immigrants are a big part of making Silicon Valley what it was and what it is. So the growth of Silicon Valley is really dependent on this type of diversity that we have in Silicon Valley. And I think that we need to fill out those forms and fight back, if you want to say it that way, and participate in the census. So we are very actively telling people that's what they need to do.
Again, you have touched on this issue already, but I want to expand on the topic of the feared undercount of communities in California, communities of color, immigrants, non-English speaking communities, even children under the age of 5. I was actually astonished to hear that especially our youngest residents are at risk of being overlooked. For example, California's Central Valley, with more than 6 million people living in the valley, a majority of whom are immigrants, conventional wisdom says the valley may be one of the state's and even the country's hardest to count regions in the 2020 census. So, as you know, if millions of people go uncounted or are disenfranchised in this census, it will affect how legislative districts are drawn and represented. How did these communities get counted in past censuses? And in your opinion, what is happening in the lead up to the 2020 census count here in California to encourage communities to participate, not only for the sake of their own families, but also for their entire communities?
Well, the state legislature has allocated millions of dollars to facilitate a outreach campaign in especially vulnerable areas of the state that have high immigrant population, high counts of people of diverse languages and ethnic origin and race. So we are going to try our extra special effort for those areas to have a complete count. And we're also supplementing that with the monies from the counties. County governments have put in my county over $5 million for our county. And we think that this should upgrade those areas. There's a lot at stake for those people. All the anti-poverty funds are allocated based on the population count. All the housing and homeless funds, and boy, we have a problem there, are allocated on the population count. We need to have our fair share of those dollars that we pay in taxes from California to the federal government, to have it come back here. A lot of people don't want it to come back here. A lot of people would just as soon take the money and spend it in their state. Taxes that we pay, that we deserve to have in our state to help our people, they would like to take that money. And we're not going to let them. We're going to have a complete count in California. And we're urging everybody and all the volunteers and all the outreach programs to fight hard to get as complete count as we can, count every little child in the state.
Well, communities didn't get counted well enough in the past. There's been an undercount before, meaning that everybody wasn't counted. Now, whether we reach every Californian, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. We suffer for every Californian that we don't count in places like the Central Valley. If you've got a transient community, for example, makes it all the more difficult to count, but all the more important to count, because not only is it important for California, but it's also important for your local community, because resources, state resources and federal resources, are often allocated based upon population. And we only know the population from the census. So if your local community has what's known as an undercount, everybody's not counted, then your community is not going to get the state and federal resources that they're entitled to, their fair share. And that's for, as I said, that's for things like roads that affect everybody, schools that affect everybody, healthcare.
Yeah, you had mentioned the homeless. Many communities have spent resources and time already trying to do a head count of the homeless population in their area in California. That particular count is pivotal and could be difficult, actually, considering the transitory nature of the homeless population, correct?
Sure. There's not a community in California that doesn't have some homeless population, none. Our community in Orange County and in Long Beach has quite a number of homeless individuals, and it's important for us to count them so that we can assess what the homeless population is and then figure out, okay, what are we going to do to transition folks from being homeless into being tax-paying members of our community. And so we need to make sure that we have an adequate count so that, for example, issues concerning mental health treatment, substance abuse are addressed.
Well, Santa Clara County has the second largest homeless population in the state behind Los Angeles. So we're working extra hard in the streets, in the rivers, counting our homeless in terms of the census. And, of course, as you can imagine, it's very difficult, but we have homeless workers working in those areas, and we're trying to achieve the best we can. We know we have a large homeless population. We're trying to count each and every one of them.
It's obviously going to take some finessing to get these communities to participate. And as I said before, they have a hardwired fear and apathy of the government. So it's got to be more than just straight up messages. You can't just get up and say, let's line up for the census, everyone. Talk about triggering reactions in a community. I mean, that would even scare or bother me. What is your comment about that?
Well, I actually, when I was a county official, we decided that we were going to have all the kids in California and all the kids in our county, in Santa Clara County, covered with health care, including undocumented kids. So what we did is we went out and we hired to do outreach for our campaign to have all the kids have health care. We hired all these community organizations that people trust. They trust the neighborhood community organizations. They work with the churches. They work with the community organizations in their community. And so what we did is we worked through them to convince them that they're going to be okay if they complete the census count and sign up for the health care. So I think the same thing applies for the census count. We have to work with our community organizations that people trust and that people have worked with in the past, and the individuals that work with those organizations right now are working with us to have a complete count for the census in our area. So we have a successful model of how to do it, and we're going to make sure that it's well funded and that we have as much resources as we need to have to get a complete count in our area.
Senator Umberg, do you, like Senator Beall, already have in your district a similar community incentive program or programs that can be used as a template for motivating communities to participate in something like this?
Sure, of course. We're reaching out to, I'm privileged to represent 9 different cities and a whole bunch of different school districts, and we're reaching out to both formal and informal community leaders to make sure that everybody within their reach, everybody that they lead, everybody that they manage, everybody they influence is basically counted in the census. In our own efforts, so for example, in our own district, we have things like charity drives for schools. We have charity drives for clothing, for working wardrobes. We have interest in teaching even self-defense classes for women. And we're signing people up, and when we sign them up, we're keeping track of who they are so we can reach out to them, make sure that they do fill out the census form.
You both have deep, rich Asian American communities in your district. It is the fastest growing population in our nation. And yet the Asian American community leaders believe they are largely misunderstood. They come from places as different as Nepal, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, but everybody looks at them as a polyglot of just one community. And actually some believe that the census is the best tool to help capture and bring out that multiplicity of the culture in the communities. But again, the leaders report a lower likelihood of filling out their census forms in that Asian American community than any other demographic group. How are you both addressing the unique needs of the Asian American communities in your district, Senator Umberg?
Well, first of all, we're going to have the census form in 13 different languages so that we can reach a number of the folks who may have concerns or may not understand what the census is about and why it's important to fill out the census form. In our own area, let me just give you an example. So we have a large Vietnamese population. Our district has a very vibrant history of all kinds of sacrifice here to come to the United States. And so in order to preserve that history, in order to preserve that language and that culture, we need to know how many Vietnamese young people we have in the district. If you don't count folks, then the need, the desire, the motivation to make sure that there's, for example, Vietnamese language instruction, then that may not be as profound as it would be if we had everyone counted.
So we have hundreds of languages in Silicon Valley. We probably got more languages than any other area of the state. Mm-hmm. In terms of Asian languages especially. About a third of our population is Asian. There's Vietnamese, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, South Asia, India, all these different groups. They all speak different languages. We have to work with each one of these groups. And there's different religious organizations. We work with those groups. So we have a mix. And we're trying to work with all the organizations. And we're hiring people that can speak all their languages and work with their communities. And our approach is to continually stress the importance to their community of why we need a good, complete count. And I think it's working right now, where I'm seeing a lot of positive results from that.
And again, I bring up the notion that the census could be the best multiplicity capturing tool in these communities. Do you agree?
Well, this year the census expanded, actually, the count specific for subgroups in the Asian community, which I think is very important. That helps us because in our area we need to find out how many different Asian communities are representative and how many people in each group. So it's part of the census process that we do that. We're trying to get a complete count so we can have the ID of the number and different languages, all the different cultural aspects. Those things can be achieved if we have a complete count in the census.
We need credible messengers, church leaders, community leaders, as I mentioned, informal leaders who have credibility, school leaders who have credibility with the communities to, one, encourage them to sign up, and two, assure them that this information will be kept confidential.
Once again, you guys are already on top of it before I was, and you've briefly referenced this earlier, but I want to delve further into the concerns that California is poised to lose a congressional seat for the first time in its history as a state. Our nation's growth has continued to slow. People migrating out of the state. More than 200,000 people have left California between 2018 and 2019 for economic and other migratory reasons. potentially dropping us from 53 to 52 congressional seats. And we use that word profound so much, but this could be the most profound impact of our census count, especially if communities are undercounted. Are you confident that we can preserve that congressional seat number?
So California is the fifth largest economy in the world. If we were a separate nation, we are clearly the largest state in the union. And we want to make sure that we receive our fair share of resources, and the only way we can do that is to have our fair share of representatives. So if we lose a seat, that diminishes our ability to have a strong voice in Washington, D.C. That's another reason to make sure that folks are counted in the census. We do have a very strong voice in Washington, D.C., and we don't want that diminished.
Well, I don't think we should lose a seat. I think we have enough people in this state, if we count them all, that we won't lose a seat, according to what I've seen. So I hope that we can get a complete count and present the data that we have showing that the population has gone up. We have more people in California, more needs, and we deserve to continue to have the same number of members of Congress voting in the halls of Congress for us. California in the congressional system, especially in the Senate, we only have 2 senators. North Dakota has 2 senators. So we don't have really the fair representation, one person, one vote, and of course in the Senate. Mm-hmm. The only place we have that is in Congress.
Right.
So we need to have a very accurate count, at least to get fair representation there. If we miss a lot of people and then we drop a member of Congress, that'll hurt the state badly. And I think we need to really work hard to make sure that doesn't happen.
Final question. The census is one of the few functions that the U.S. Constitution mandates for our federal government. It should be sacrosanct. It should be pure. It applies to the country's leaders who are working on this process as much as it does the rank and file, boots-on-the-ground workers who are dedicated to conducting a sound count. I guess other than doing podcasts like this, how do you, as elected officials, as members and representatives in your community, inspire those communities in your district, or all across the state really, to get involved, to participate, and to motivate others?
Well, the people that are doing the outreach are approaching various organizations, explaining what the census does and why we need it. And I think if you have an organization or your school or your club or anything else, you can easily get the census to come out and make a presentation so you become more informed, and then you can spread the word about the census. So we have this outreach program that would really help, and we want the public to get involved in that. And if you have an organization or a club or some place that you can get some people together to talk about the census, we'll have them come out and make a presentation. Just contact us, and we'll make sure that they come out right away.
The way we inspire people is to demonstrate by example, number one, that we think it's important, and number two, by letting people know, look at 2 things. One, that in order to get our fair share of resources, you need to be counted. And 2, this information is going to be kept confidential. So you should have no fear in filling out the form and making sure that every single member of your neighborhood, your family, your community is counted. And
do you get the sense, and this goes back to my opening questions, do you get the sense that people are on board with this, that the vibe of this, if you will, is positive, that people are enthusiastic?
That's what we're about. That's what we're working hard to make sure that we create a situation where people recognize the importance, and number 2, they recognize the confidentiality. So that's what we're about. That's what we're trying to create.
Gentlemen, we'll wrap it up here. I know you are both busy, and I so much appreciate your yeoman efforts to make the 2020 census successful, for your leadership on the census here in the State Senate, and also for joining me again here on Then There's California.
You're welcome, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. Senator Tom Umberg of Garden Grove in Orange County, the co-chair of the State Senate Select Committee on the 2020 census, and Senator Jim Beall of Santa Clara, the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. And that is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Sabiniano, Gunjan Patel, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Blake Hooper, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Tom Umberg and State Senator Jim Beall, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.